My name is Randy Silva. I'm with the Board of Equalization. I'm the chief of their Investigations and Special Operations Division. I was asked to give a couple of case studies on how we're using data in investigations. And then I'm going to pass it off to Carl, who's going to talk about some of the great things we could be doing that perhaps we're not doing. So I thought I would start with a claim for refund fraud. This was a case that came to our attention from our audit review section. And basically what we had is, to give you a little background, is that sales tax lender bad debts, RNT section 6055 and regulation 1642 allow for auto dealers to assign their right to claim a refund on sales tax paid on auto bad debts. So where they defaulted on an auto loan, they were entitled to a refund. Lenders can further assign that right of claim to refund on a sales tax to an assignee. The assignee then can file the claim for refund. In this particular case, we had a licensed California CPA, well recognized in the community. He operated a private accounting and financial management firm. He consulted on bad debt legislation in the legislature as well as before our board on regulations that were established. So somebody well known and trusted within the community. He represented prominent clients, including one bank that received over $44 million in bad debt refunds. What he did was he sort of got comfortable in what he was doing and decided, well, gee, maybe I can make a little money for myself doing this. So he established a paper corporation called Premier Financial Capital. He submitted an agreement for assignment of lenders' rights to act as the assignee for Premier Capital Finance. He submitted 1,800 documents entitled Agreement for Entitlement to Refund. Basically, these were from the individual purported auto dealers. He submitted a CD containing thousands of auto bad debts. These were the individual defaulted loans. The claim totaled, the one claim totaled $4.6 million. And the data on the CD, which was tens of thousands of auto bad debts, identified vehicle VIN numbers, dealer information, and the lender information. The auditor that it came to in the Board of Equalization only had the CD that he provided to work with against the claim for refund. She verified the bad debts, that they were legitimate bad debts. She requested and received authentication of write-off from the CPA, which was basically an attorney for a law firm, a prominent law firm, said, you know what, I certify that these companies have written this off on their income tax, which is a requirement. Received additional sample for verification because there were some questions, and basically approved the claim for refund, for payment. Went to our headquarters office, which is our billing department. Basically, they also issue the refunds. And was one of the first for 5 for that company, totaling $16.2 million. We had an alert audit reviewer at our headquarters who had recognized the name of the accounting firm. And in fact, they had recently been charged for defrauding a basketball player, Ben Gordon, who had invested with them, and he lost over $1.3 million. So she said, well, maybe there's more to this than meets the eye. And also she questioned the corporation because the start date on the corporation was 5 days after the date of the claims for refunds. And the officers didn't seem to jive with the officers that were identified for Premier Capital. So they finally decided to turn it over to investigations. We obtained the corporation documents on the officers, and they were in fact not the same officers. We looked at the start date of all the 1,800 documents. All the 1,800 documents had one date for the claim for refunds, and the start date of the corporation was 5 years after that date. We interviewed the CEO of Premier Capital. What he had done was he had taken, when he worked for that bank, he had taken and copied electronic signatures for the CEO of the bank, which this is no longer an active bank, so he's no longer the CEO of that bank, and the VP, and he used those to apply those to the assignment documents. We interviewed him. He denied any involvement with Premier, claimed the documents were forged. He's now working for another bank. He wanted to go after identity theft, but we actually asked them to cooperate with us because we were now asking the perpetrator for additional documents to support his claim for refunds, and he was going to these same people and asking for additional documents so that he could manipulate them and forge them and submit them. We contacted the law firm. There was no such attorney working for that firm. The attorney under the name could not be found anywhere in California's bar directory. Based upon that, we had enough probable cause to execute search warrants on his business and his home. At the time of the execution of the search warrant, when he found out we were going to do his home, he was kind of cocky when we first went in. When we found out we were going to do his home, all of a sudden he just started, look, I did it, I'm guilty, and he started explaining all the rights. Apparently he didn't want us to talk to his wife. Anyway, he admitted to falsifying the documents. He admitted to submitting $16 million in false bad debt claims to the BOE, and he explained how he did it. One of the things I want to point out is one of the things the Board of Equalization is big on. We're big on partnerships with other enforcement agencies. This one was done with the Department of Justice. Anyway, immediately his CPA license was revoked. He still had a number of these refunds for legitimate companies in place, so we had to go back through and look at all those. He pled guilty. I think he's still doing part of his 16-month sentence. What we learned from this is that we need to do more data aggregation. We have these that are filed all over the state of California in individual audits, but all the data is electronic. And so we get all those VIN numbers and we get all that information from the individuals, the banks, or the loan finance companies in support of their claim for refunds, but we never aggregated it to look at whether or not they're, have already been claimed. In some cases, there would be potentially other claims, but you wouldn't see 10,000 of them. So we decided that we needed to start aggregating that and come up with some analytical way to go back against it to verify that when we're getting these, they're not claiming bad debts that have already been claimed. We also saw an opportunity to do some predictive analysis on how these things come in, and that we looked at a sample of a number of them that had come in over the previous years, and all the financial institutions that turn these in are roughly within 10% of any other claim they did. So we said, well, let's set a bar. Anything over that, we give it more scrutiny. So that's one. I wanted to give you a little background on the Board of Equalization, how we do investigations. There's audit selection. Historically, this goes back a few years. Audit selection, which is based on complaints, and 1164 referrals, where we've done an audit of another business. Then we found something that didn't look right on potentially another business, so they do an 1164 referral that goes into that business's file. Known bad actors within the community. Industry focus, where we've identified through audits that a particular industry is having problems with compliance. Then an audit gets assigned to an auditor. They go out and they initiate it. If they find fraud or they have suspicion of fraud, then they'll do a referral if it's over, our criteria is over $75,000. Under California law, fraud in tax is $25,000 evaded in a 12-month period. Today, we do data analysis and matching. It's not, I don't want to say it's not sophisticated because it is sophisticated, but we're not doing a lot of analytics behind it. We're mostly just doing matching. We're taking some data. Then we do audit selection. That audit selection results in cells going out to the fields, the field offices where they're recommended to do audits. Again, they look at complaints that may have come in, 1164 referrals. The same criteria, known bad actors, industry focus. We do it the same way with fraud suspicion. If there's a dollar threshold, then it's referred to investigations. Historically, data is obtained from federal, state, and local government agencies. There are a lot of agencies that the board has different data streams coming into it from. Some of them include EDD, DMV, IRS, ABC, various cities, and certain industries that are heavily regulated. We have a lot of data. I'll be the first to admit we're not using it as efficiently as we could be as it relates to fraud identification and prevention. Today, we have those same government entities and resources, but we're also getting more data that's being legislatively mandated. We're also getting data that's being voluntarily provided by industries that want to help self-regulate themselves. And we're getting data we get through subpoenas and through search warrants. So we've got a mountain of data. Historically, auditors, I was going to do another example, use auto industry. Historically, auditors will look at ROS with a report of sale books and bank deposits and note any kind of significant discrepancy in reported sales tax. Probable cause is developed via the audit, sales observations, interviews, a reconciliation of the ROS books as compared to the reported sales tax returns. Based upon significant discrepancies, we'll establish probable cause. We'll go in and do search warrants, obtain all those dealer jackets and any other records we can get. Typically, we go after bank records for the company. Nowadays, a lot of that is provided digitally. It used to be it was all paper. What we're doing, when I say present day, that probably goes back about 6, 8 months, maybe even as far as a year. What we're doing today is we've gone out, we went to auto auction houses, and we said, we want all your data on all of your sales, your wholesales to used car dealers. And they provided it under subpoena, over 5 million transactions for a certain period of time. We looked at that data, we matched it to our BOE registration. One of the things we found is we found people operating without licenses. The other thing we found is that people were buying a whole heck of a lot more cars than they were reporting in sales, so it didn't make a lot of sense. And as we went along, we also decided we could get this CMVR, which is California Motor Vehicle Recovery Fund data. And what this data does is it includes the dealer ID, purchase price, number of vehicles sold, and the ROS number. Now, what we got from DMV historically in terms of any kind of data, we could never really tell exactly what ROS book, in other words, what transactions tied to which dollars. It was just kind of a huge data dump. And now we're able to tie it to specific ROS numbers. What that did for us was any purchases that exceeded reported sales over a 3-year period from the private industry data, the auto auctions, we could take a look at to get a sense of whether or not fraud might be occurring. We could look at the CMVR sales data collected, which is collected by DMV, and then we could match that against our reported sales. And what we were able to do is identify now, instead of waiting for the districts to give us a referral on potential felony tax evasion, we could see it occurring at a much higher level throughout the industry. Again, these are indicators. We still have to establish knowledge and intent and all those good things that go with criminal cases. So today we're doing a little more data analysis and matching. We still have some audit selection. That's how some of them come forward. One of the problems when you assign an audit to an auditor is that when they're out there and they're collecting this, when they suspect fraud, they have to conclude the audit at that point and forward it to the investigations in order to do a criminal case. If they suspect fraud and they continue to collect using the civil means information that incriminates the taxpayer, then essentially it has to be pursued as a civil action or an administrative action. You can't take criminal action against it. So going forward, what the ideal situation is that you have data matching and analytics. You identify fraud potentially at a much higher level within the process. Again, the dollar threshold is meaningful, and then it gets referred to investigations, and we can look at establishing the knowledge and intent. Did they have a prior permit with the Board of Equalization? What are they reporting? Basically, those two things, if there's huge differences, gives you enough probable cause to do a search warrant, and the rest is pretty much history. The benefits of data-based fraud detection is it identifies egregious tax evaders quickly. Since we started doing this in the used car industry, we probably got 1 or 2 referrals from our district offices a year. We've done 11 under this. Our historical sort of tax evasion number for sales tax across all programs is about $500,000 per case. Every one of these cases is over, or multi-million-dollar cases. So we were zeroing in on a problem at the highest level of the industry using data versus the traditional way. It initiates a criminal investigation early on, eliminating additional tax losses to the state, provides for a streamlined, efficient, data-driven investigation. One thing about data is the numbers don't lie. When you chart them and everything, they prove out well in a jury. Removes potential for violating the taxpayer rights, which is what I referred to earlier, and it levels the playing field for honest businesses. Some of the lessons we've learned in this process is to eliminate organizational information silos. Within our organization, we had some informational silos. People didn't want to share the data. It was, I can get better audits if I use this data, which increases my return on audit. Well, that doesn't really do the state of California the best service. The best service is to go after the most egregious, criminally prosecute them, so you affect change within the industry. Identify data experts for each data stream. We did an exercise within the organization where we looked at some data sets that we were getting from other agencies, and we, that always kills me, 5 minutes. we looked at that data, and what we did is we determined that there was a significant amount of tax loss to California, about $250 million. And this is one data set within certain zip codes within California. And what we learned in that process is, as we further sort of explored it out, is by not being really all that familiar with the data sources that we were getting from other agencies, is that as we got more familiar, some of that number normalized. It still ended up being a significant amount, somewhere around 50 million, but it was crucial to have people that understood the data sources, the data streams that we were applying towards our analytical process. The other thing that the Board of Equalization is moving towards, we're establishing a data analysis analytics team that includes domain experts, people very familiar with the different types of data streams that we're getting. It also includes data miners, analysts, and from my point of view, fraud specialists. What happens a lot in government, as well as private enterprise, I think, is that you have a product or a service, and when, at least with government, when legislation happens, the first thing we want to do is figure out the best way to do customer service, the best way to get the program delivered in the most efficient manner. We don't always look at what holes are we creating for fraudsters to exploit, and there are a lot of fraudsters out there these days. I think that's it. Mid my time. He never got a dime. We actually caught him in the early stages of the investigation before he received any money.
Prepayment detection, that is a key. That is a really critical message, because you're right, you know how little the dollars you get back in these big cases in situations like that. Hello everyone, good afternoon. Carl Hammersburg with SAS. I work with government all around the country, also with Canada and Latin America. Prior to that, I spent 21 years in government, seeing it firsthand like Randy did up in Washington State. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here. So Randy's talked quite a bit about specific cases, walked you through a little bit of how they went, how they found them, how they could have found them in the future, that beginning of that vision. How do we get there? I'm going to talk about it a little bit deeper and how some people are tackling it today. First thing I want to do is really think about what are the spectrums of we're really looking at. So the first one you can really think about is kind of the front door is intrusion. Or this is like cybersecurity, and I'll talk a little bit more about a specific case with relation to that. You're thinking, well, gosh, what does that have to do with fraud? Well, it's pretty amazing how much these things are related these days. Sometimes it's an unrelated issue, but government can really feel the effects of cybersecurity breaches both within government as well as other places. Second piece is really looking at authentication. So there's a couple different versions of this. One is that idea when you're starting to get so you get these requests for refunds, they've taken a different name, they've taken that different thing. Is it really that person? And so sometimes I'll get questions, I'm sure some of you have seen this, oh, you're using a new device, you're in a new location. So they start asking you some questions from your own personal history. Which of these addresses did you live at? Which county were you in 2000? Those kinds of things. That's one method of authentication. Another is really looking at the session, at your behavior in it. How do you normally do your login? Is that the way that it's going? Oh, you're normally right-handed, yet you typed it just as fast, but we can tell it was all left-handed. Did it take you 4 or 5 times to get your login this time when you normally do it in one particular case? This can also help when you start to think about it in terms of insider threat. Is there something that's going on from someone within your agency itself that's starting to become a risky behavior? Or has an intrusion actually now created an insider threat? They're starting to take over those accounts, take over those logins, and begin to do other pieces. Eligibility. So really thinking about this in terms of benefits programs, or you could even look at it in terms of, are you really eligible for a tax refund? Trying to look at the rest of the data that we have about you, and this is where data sharing starts to become really critical. What do we know about you, and based on what we know about you from this program and from other places within the state, should you really be eligible for those benefits? It would be very, very helpful if, as we're trying to make a decision around Medicaid eligibility, around eligibility for CalFresh, those types of things, let's take a look at tax data and begin to say, well, should you really be eligible for that? It doesn't look like it. Or you just filed for unemployment as well. How many benefits should you be getting at one particular point in time? And then it is those analytics, starting to really begin to look at things more deeply. Eligibility, a lot of that's just the pure data matching, but here it's starting to look at things to say, based on the past cases we've seen, how does this fit a predictive model? Not how did we find them in the past, but what were the data points that were really critical? How could we have found them earlier? And the analytics need to be continuous. Too often, I did this myself within my own program. We started doing data mining. We started putting things together, but it was really rudimentary. It was those early steps. And we'd do one project and then move to another and move to another, as opposed to saying, we need to take a look at all of this using the analytics continuously. Make sure that we're really updating the information as it's changing day by day and scoring for them. And then eventually starting to think about it from a broader enterprise view. So, let's talk about a place where it went wrong. South Carolina's Department of Revenue. So a relative counterpart to yours, but they dealt with both sales tax as well as income taxes. And they had a breach. So that beginning, that very first beginning, is cybersecurity and the intrusion. 3.6 million Social Security numbers. Ton of business data, ton of other information, but a very, very significant breach, and it took them a long time to find it. So it kept going. So that idea of that, that insider threat, they'd gotten in through it, but it wasn't a one-time grab. They were taking data over time, slowly. Look what it cost them, for $14 million to just deal with the cleanup from this. I mean, that's a very, very significant expense. And when you think about the costs of a cleanup from one thing going wrong versus the cost to really take care of the system up front, there's such a difference there, not to mention the reputational risk. You know, that agency is going to take years and years to recover. The entire state has a black eye. What was funny is we were actually doing a session there that was scheduled like a week or so after when this event happened. Completely unrelated, it had been booked for months, and it went from a small room like this to 400 people, multiple TV crews, cameras, and everything else. That's not the way that they wanted things to go. So, how does it all relate? What if the issue wasn't a breach of Department of Revenue? What if it was Target? Raise your hand if you've received some nice emails from Target saying that you've been put at risk. Oh yeah, it's me too. Okay, good luck, folks. You know, and this is the second year in a row that I've received that kind of notice from somebody. Now, the first one took something proactively, shut down the credit card themselves. They didn't even really tell who it was that exposed it. It was my bank that was taking action on it, but this was directly from Target. Once there's been a data breach, you now have a 1 in 4 chance of somehow being a victim of identity theft. So, what does that mean? 12.6 million individuals in a year, just in the United States. And we have a higher rate than many other countries. Why? Because we're easier to breach. There's so much data electronically. You've heard about the lack of protection around cards, the fact that we're not using chip and pin, all those kinds of things are issues. But where do they use those identities now? 43% of the time, it's fraud coming back to government. So it didn't matter that the breach wasn't from government, that you weren't the ones that weren't protecting that front door. They're coming back to use it against you. That's where that idea of authentication, eligibility, analytics all comes into play. Can you imagine that? That 43% is higher than both credit card, debit card, and bank account fraud now put together in terms of the percentage of time that's exposed. Be thankful you're in California. Florida, it's 75%. Okay? And 9 of the top 10 metro areas. So, with that, you've now seen the connection. Exposure over here equals a risk for you. It might be a false refund filing, and that's a huge growing area. When I started doing tax 20 plus years ago myself, we were worried about who to audit that was trying to pay less than what they owed. Not people that are just completely making up things and trying to turn us into a source of income. That's a dramatic change. And as we sped up refunds, as the IRS has sped up refunds, it becomes a greater exposure. So, when we start to think about the analytics themselves, what does that mean? What are we talking about? Well, you start with the traditional things. You do start with some basic rules. There's some that make sense. You're dead. I'm not going to let you keep filing claims. Great. That's a good rule. Stop. Don't turn that one off. Keep it going. You know, and do those matches. Do those matches across those data sets to see, do we really know, what do we really know about this person? Well, that's great that you're filing for benefits here, but according to everything we see from other data sources, you live in Oklahoma. Show me that you just moved here in the last couple of weeks. Great, let's talk about it. It may not mean it's an automatic, but it's a great place to start. It's a great place to request additional information, to start to narrow down who could be a problem to who is a problem. But you miss a lot. You pick arbitrary thresholds, they stay under them, We found a business that was reporting in a manner that was almost impossible when compared to their peer group, but perfectly met our thresholds for not ever being audited. And the way we found them was analytics, anomaly detection. Start to compare people, businesses, recipients, providers, vendors, whoever you're thinking about, whatever area you might be exposed to, contracts fraud, procurement fraud, grant fraud. Compare them to their peers, and I truly mean peers. If we're thinking about businesses, a construction company looks like a construction company. They don't look like a restaurant. They don't look like a software company. It's very, very different in terms of revenues, reporting, employment, risks, all those kinds of things. Compare them to their peers. Start to find the outliers. This is also great when you start to think about identity theft. You can become an anomaly to yourself. I have a tendency, so let's say I, for example, had a tendency to owe tax. So what do people do that owe tax? They tend to wait until that deadline. I'm going to wait until April 15th. I'm not giving the IRS that check until the end of the day, and there's a ton of information that typically comes with it, complex tax file. So all of a sudden this year, you see a return that comes in extremely early with almost none of the backup information requesting a big refund. That's an extreme anomaly compared to myself, a great opportunity to start to look at that return and see if this is a case where we're talking about identity theft. Predictive models. Predictive models based on all those past cases that you have. So it would be looking at everything that Randy's folks saw from all those audits deeply and saying, well, here's how you found this one, but what are all the data points that are really there? How could you have found them? And how could you find them early? How can you really catch them? You caught those prepayment. But this is especially critical for things that built up over a long period of time. Get a sense of what's going on, develop those models, find them early. These two work great in conjunction. Predictive models use your own past cases. Anomaly detection just looks at the data. Said the data doesn't lie, you'll find those outliers. You'll find some really interesting things there, and it helps detect new schemes. You can start to look at unstructured data, text mining. The vast, vast majority of people that I see, of places that are even being smart and are protecting themselves, don't look at any of the unstructured data. Any of those phone calls with taxpayer services, anything else that was going on from caseworkers and reviews and those types of things, websites, being able to scrape that unstructured text, pull it in and put it into context. Medical reports, those kinds of things. And then build out a network. As much as one big case can help you, what about the case that involves 50 or 60 or 80 individuals? Some of the work that we did at the federal level in the Medicare program looked at just the top 5 networks of provider fraud, $184 million. Huge. And the key there is it's networks. The opportunity to work these kinds of things from the networks down to the individual cases completely changes what the return on investment becomes for each of your staff. The goal here is not just to find more things, but to find the right things and get people working on the cases that have the biggest risks, and then take everything else and say, there's different ways of handling these things. If we know more about you, we can engage differently. So, thinking about the enterprise approach, and this is, I'm showing a pretty broad view of enterprise here. You can take a much smaller one. You can take one with a single agency that does already have multiple streams and silos or multiple programs and start to think about it from your enterprise, begin to look at it. But the idea here is you have a citizen and they can be interacting with many different programs. And today, in many cases, they each have a separate view of what that person looks like. And those views may not look the same. It's like that exercise where everyone touches a different piece of the elephant and try and figure out what it is. So everyone's touching a different piece of that elephant, but you never realize it's an elephant. What if you can start to take that data, pull it together into a shared place where you can share it? And there are legal restrictions. We need to really be thoughtful of what they look like and how do we do data sharing and when can you help out other programs? And start to look at a consolidated view of that individual or of that business or of that vendor. To be able to get a better look at them. If you started to compare tax data on what one individual business looks like, let's say a small sort of corner retail store, compared to what they're doing in terms of CalFresh, in terms of EBT cards and what's going on there, and you start to see, wait a second, for the size, how could they possibly be doing this kind of level redemptions? That's what Walmart looks like in other places. We begin to start to see those different views of them. You can then start to get into a common technology framework. It's not required, but that's where you can really start to leverage that piece, regardless of what that framework is. It's working on top of that data, being able to start to run the analytics and really show a comprehensive view of these different people. And then you can feed them back to the different programs. It's not about the one audit group or one investigative group to rule them all, which I occasionally hear as an idea. It's that each person still works their things, but they have some visibility to what's going on with other places. That's really that idea of saying we don't have to all work together on every single case, but sometimes we're going to. Sometimes one specific program has better tools and should take the lead. And really think about it that way. But the goal here, the real value, is if you do this well, use the right analytics, you use the data, you start to look at things, you get it past just being an audit or investigation. You get that data, those decisions back into the business areas. So when you're really thinking about what's going on in terms of risk, where's that frontline person that's making an eligibility decision? And what if they had enough information right at the beginning to make a better determination? Not everything's always about fraud even. Sometimes it's abuse, sometimes it's just waste because we don't know what we should have known at the right point in time. It lets you start to change things from a policy standpoint to help address the risks so that you're not just saying, oh, we have the same hammer for every single solution. And the other piece around that is really to be able to do a lighter touch. One of the things I've seen that really helped when we went down this road in Washington State and with some of the other folks is saying when we find a new and emerging issue or we find something that's lower dollars, we don't need an audit investigation at all. We can engage with them around an educational piece, ask for corrective action, and you can get tremendous results with very, very little time or money spent. The IRS is doing that now with our engine. They're taking a look at it, and when certain scores happen around particular issues, instead of sending it to audit investigations, they're just holding the refund. So this idea of prepayment, we're not going to send the money out the door, and then they're asking for additional information. 90% of the time when they do that, the request for refund gets no follow-up and they just disappear. Talk about a way of dealing with those ghost preparer rings, identity theft, the rest of that, and it cost them nothing. It was an electronic follow-up to ask for additional information. Most of the rest of the 10%, they were just missing some of the information. They submitted it all and actually went into the stream that looked okay. It's a way of really thinking differently from the way we do it today. But you need the data, you need the analytics to be able to say, here's why you look like an issue, and here's something we want from you. So, I wanted to touch on a few case studies, a few different states that are approaching things in different ways. There are different levels of the maturity around what we've talked about, just to give you a sense of what's possible. One of these is Louisiana. They decided about 4 years ago to engage in an enterprise approach to fraud. So they started that from a perspective of saying, we're going to do an enterprise approach, we're going to have an enterprise contract. But then their choice of how they began down that path was to start with one agency. They said, okay, we have the Louisiana Workforce Commission. They take care of unemployment, tax, and claims, and they also deal with workers' compensation. So ultimately the goal is we're going to protect these three programs. That's what we're going to start with, and then we'll expand from there. So that was their way of saying, we have a broader view, but we realize we're not very sophisticated right now. We need to start small. And they really had some severe limitations. I mean, they were still shuffling some things around on paper. So I mean, this was a real leap for them in terms of thinking about it. What was great is that opportunity to be able to pull data from disparate systems. So even if you are using Excel over here and Access over there, and you have a 30-year-old mainframe system, and you've got some stuff that's bright and new and shiny, all of that, the data can be pulled from all of those. You don't have to update every single system in order to be able to do these kinds of analytics. And now they're coming back around to other programs saying, okay, let's get this expanded to tax and to withholding and to these other areas. And eventually it'll break into some of the other programs around benefits and that kind of stuff. But that's one method. North Carolina took a very, very different approach. They decided to really think about things in enterprise with a big E. Okay? They weren't just even thinking about fraud, waste, and abuse and risk, but everything that could be enterprise. Thinking about it from an enterprise view of what do we know about courts and corrections and offenders? You know, how do we do other things from really an analytics center of excellence? And so they decided to set that up in their controller's office and then essentially look at each type of area or type of issue as a separate sort of plank in building this out. So they built out different systems, and one of those happened to be around fraud, waste, and abuse. And they chose a number of different programs across multiple agencies to begin to build that out, and they're expanding it from there. But that was a very different view, and their whole goal there is we're going to have an analytics center of excellence, and ultimately this will help us in revenue forecasting, making giant policy decisions for our state, be able to really know what's going on. Los Angeles County, I wanted to grab one that was more local here. This was very interesting. They started really with just looking at subsidized childcare, saying, okay, we realize we're finding fraud here. There's a number of issues around that, and we're having trouble finding networks in particular. So that was one of their big focuses I mentioned earlier. It's this idea of network fraud, a lot higher returns, big risks. And and that already started with, with 5 different systems, a lot of data that was siloed. They found great success, and luckily they studied it and reported on it. A lot of times, that's one of the things we don't do the best in government, is you do some really cool things, you got better, but it's really hard to explain how much better. If you don't track all the numbers, you don't really talk about what the changes were and how you achieve them and when you achieve them. But now they're really looking at a number of different things. So they are looking at, at CalFresh. They're looking at in-home support services. They're looking at a lot of different things from a fraud perspective. And it also really opened up their minds around how do we think about other things? How do we really look at an indigent adult population and all the services, either planned or emergency, that we may provide for them? And what's the basket of services that we really should be providing that gets the best outcomes at the lowest cost? And stop some of that. It's an emergency. It's an emergency. Really, how do you deal with those kinds of things? Kentucky decided to take the opportunity in setting up a state healthcare exchange as the point of their spear around doing enterprise fraud. So that was a very interesting one, and one of the nice things about it, and a lot of other programs here can get federal matching funds. So if you're thinking, oh, the cost of doing the right thing is a barrier, but many programs can get 50%, 75%. They got a 90% match from CMS to do enterprise fraud. They only had to come up with a few $100,000. I mean, absolutely amazing. The kind of stuff where I went, oh my gosh, my own little program could have come up with that much. Geez, I end up with this big request to the legislature, spending millions of dollars. And that was the way they approached it. And they decided to say, okay, we're going to start with eligibility for everything. Medicaid, SNAP, food stamps, TANF, welfare. All these programs are going to be protected at once. Even though that wasn't necessarily a complete vision of what CMS had, they loved the idea. And those were all programs that still have that federal interchange. Largely, there were a couple things they included that didn't, to try to be able to just layer in a piece that began that enterprise vision through one particular method. So that was a very interesting one that we saw. And, so, excuse me, a little bit of my own history here. Washington State, we ended up really creating enterprise without trying to. So I'll just freely admit that. What it was I was evangelizing the idea of we need to do the right thing, we need to protect the program. I worked within the Department of Labor up there, and we had a lot of different programs within our purview, and we had a number of partners. And we really changed the way that we brought in their data, how we shared it, when we brought it in, and what we did with it. We'd been doing a lot of matching. We'd been doing a lot of data mining with tools, and we'd had great success with it. Unfortunately, it was that situation where you had to get better to realize how far away you were from the finish line. We're like, yay, we're winning awards. Turn around and realize, oh man, I'm 100 yards from the start, and we're trying to run a marathon. That's not very good. So it really gave us that realization of where we wanted to go. We said, okay, let's create an enterprise vision. Let's really go at it. And we ended up pulling in data from 5 different agencies, 15 different programs, and federal data from the IRS and other places. So pretty large system, really to focus on just our key issues. But what happened was, just by pulling that together, even though we were modeling for some things within my agency, the issues were so related to the other agencies that we started finding a ton of referrals for them. And as we started finding referrals for these other agencies, they started to ask, well, how are you finding all this stuff? I mean, we'd always shared from our audits, investigations, but they wanted to know what was going on. We brought them in, showed them the system. They're like, we already have all our data in here. Can we just do some modeling for us? And it was really that idea of like, oh, and it's all in one interface. My goodness. Oh, and you leapt right past your 30-year-old system, and you've got stuff that used to just have an access, but it's all playing together in one data mart. So, you know, it was really that idea of, you know, apparently if you build it, they will come. We weren't even trying to get them to come. So I just wanted to show that no matter where you're at today, you can do it. You can get there. And you can do things in a manner that's a really big, grand vision from the beginning, or you can do something that's much smaller, and you can still find some real fantastic success with it. I realize we're close to up on time. Can definitely take 5, you're showing? OK. Whew. I like that. You're nicer than my clock. So we've got a few minutes for questions here, and definitely as we kind of move out into session break, Randy and I will make ourselves available if you want to connect offline as well. Any questions? Yes?
How important is social media in doing some of the fraud detection?
Either one of us could answer that. Social media.
Well, I mean, in the example I gave you where the person identified that Harmon had well, I said his name, perpetrator.
It's criminal, that's public.
Yeah, it is public. I mean, that was in social media, that assessment for the 1.3 million. So, I mean, it is, we use it. It's amazing what people tell about themselves in social media. I mean, and sometimes about businesses they're running that they're not even licensed to run.
And that's very true. I mean, you definitely saw it in my own past agency. We utilized Facebook, YouTube, other places. It was stunning where we would get things from. You know, one of our cases, it actually started because the guy was on the show Axeman. Okay, now that's as social as you can possibly get. That's pretty out there with your fraud. Okay, that's interesting. You know, now the idea here, though, is going from the manual investigation of those types of things to be able to say, let's take a look when we already know who we're looking for, or you're just scraping some of those kinds of things, Craigslist, that kind of stuff, and be able to say, how, you know, take that automated piece, some of that text mining, those kinds of things, and aim it out at specific websites, and then be able to pull something back that's direct enough that you can actually connect it with the people that you have. It's difficult, but it's definitely doable. And when you can, it's amazing. Because you're right, the things they're saying out there are dramatically different than what they're telling government. Now, sometimes those are all lies too. But you know, when you can start to see all the activities, and they've got details on it, and they have the photos on it, and all those kinds of things that just don't map with what you know about them, it's pretty powerful.
What level does that balance with the NSA and gathering and looking at collecting information that you wouldn't expect somebody to have, phone records, Facebook, as such? So where's the balance?
I'm not paying attention to Angela Merkel. So no, I mean that's you have a good point there. Really, it's about publicly available data. So I mean, like things that they're putting on public websites that anybody can access, things that they're putting on public Facebook profiles, things that they're putting out on YouTube. It's stuff that is available, so we're not, in fact, cracking into something that we shouldn't be doing. And even though law enforcement occasionally would like to do that, there's search warrants and all sorts of things that would come before things like that, as opposed to you're just launching in on it. At that point, to get those search warrants, you need to know exactly who you're looking at. You need to give a ton of evidence on why they're interesting, on what you already know, before you could ever start to get into those personal records. And that's a big deal. I mean, my state has some pretty tough laws around those kinds of things. Like you cannot record somebody audio. You can have the video, but you can't do audio without them acknowledging and even, let's say, approving it. So, yeah. So, a balance there. I got the 1 minute, and it looks like we're just about out here. Randy, any last?
No. Any questions?
Okay.
How do we get a job in this?
Bill back there, he's higher up in the organization than I am. We want to say thank you very much to everybody. If you do have some stuff you want to take offline, I'll be out in the lobby. We've got cards, that kind of stuff. We'd be happy to connect with you. Thank you so much.